Thanks for the introduction. So Canada is a great place to talk about the problem of extreme heat. So today I'd like to talk about the urban heat island effect, which is a phenomenon whereby cities tend to be hotter than the surrounding suburbs. And this research we conducted in Sydney, Australia, which reportedly can be up to 5 degrees hotter than its surroundings. And as urban populations grow and the overall surface temperatures trend upwards around the world, this is a critical and timely problem to consider for HCI. So in our work, we ask, how can mitigation and adaptation approaches be supported through design? And to explore this question, we frame heat as a wicked problem. So wicked problems are societal problems that are hard to define and very difficult to solve. They involve complex systems of actors that don't always share the same goals. And they also concern policy, planning, science, and society at large, and can't always be solved by traditional paradigms of engineering. And sustainability broadly can be seen as a wicked problem for HCI. And in our work, we see heat as a subdomain of sustainable HCI. So in our work, we use documentary filmmaking as an ethnographically-oriented research method. And through this method, we uncover how different actors pursue diverse and sometimes opposing approaches to the issues of human health, economy, social justice, within the context of heat. So the outline of my talk today is quite simple. First, I'll tell you about our methods and about our participants. Then I'll report on our findings, and I'll conclude with some implications. So let's start with the method. So we're definitely not the first people to use documentary filmmaking as a research method in HCI. This method is very powerful because it can capture the nuances of everyday life, and it can support discourse between the filmmakers, the subjects of the film, and the general audience. It also can involve stakeholders in co-constructing a narrative around an issue. So in our work, we wanted to develop a narrative that engages with urban heat and gives voice to the various actors and their values and practices. So we reached out to a really diverse set of stakeholders, including government officials, vulnerable communities, activists, researchers, architects, infrastructure developers. 9 people agreed to participate in our film, 3 of them female. And of course, I should say that there is a strong selection bias with documentary filmmaking. So in our case, people did not want to participate in the project, sometimes because they felt unqualified to publicly speak about the problem of heat, and also because sometimes their employer didn't give them clearance to speak publicly on the subject. Luckily, we did have a range of people who agreed to participate in the project. So to give you kind of the rundown of what they did. So we had 2 microclimate researchers who had a background in engineering and architecture and conducted PhD level research on urban microclimates. We had sustainability researchers who worked with local groups on the ground to examine how heat impacted everyday lives. We had sustainable architects in the film who work on sustainable development projects such as green roofs, home insulation, and rainwater harvesting systems. We also had 2 participants who implement local grassroots cooling initiatives in their neighborhoods, including pale pavement, drain gardens, and solar power. And finally, we worked with a homeless health service manager and also a health and safety coordinator for Australia's Construction Workers Union to give voice to vulnerable communities who are most affected by extreme heat. With these participants, we conducted documentary-style interviews. So these interviews consisted of site visits to their place of work. And a large portion of the visit was actually about building trust, empathy, and rapport before the filming began. So when we actually turned on the camera, there was this delicate moment where participants realized they were no longer talking to just us, but actually talking to the entire world through this method. So we tried our best to maintain continuity between the initial chat and the filmed interviews, often by revealing something personal about ourselves when the camera started rolling. And only about 30 to 60 minutes of each site visit were actually filmed. So our interview scripts were generative, and they often followed up on themes from previous interviews. And this required much preparation behind the scenes because As with interview filmmaking, we had to research each participant's background and develop questions that were specific to them. And also we tried to link each interview to previous interviews to put the participants in conversation with each other. So then, as we were reviewing the footage, we discovered, well, there are some interesting implications for HCI. So we did receive IRB approval to then analyze the data, and the data was transcribed and coded. And then out of courtesy, we contacted all of the participants, informing them of this post-analysis and giving them the option to opt out, which luckily for us, they did not. So there are 3 high-level themes that emerged from our findings. And I'll talk about participants' understanding of the urban heat island effect first. So all participants shared a basic understanding of what the problem was, and they also understood that this problem might get worse over the coming years. But there were some very distinct differences in perspective about the causes and effects of this problem, depending on what participants did and where they worked. So first, there were different emphasis on different contributing factors of heat. So the researcher participants focused on urban infrastructure as the leading cause of urban heat. So they talked about thermal mass, the amount of light and heat reflected from buildings onto pedestrians, perviousness, the degree to which materials could retain water, and other material and infrastructure factors. Other participants placed a lot more emphasis on human activity as the leading cause of urban heat. So they talked about individual level behaviors such as driving or car traffic, or the heat generated from air conditioning, or the overconsumption of resources as the leading cause of the urban heat problem. The impacts were also discussed quite differently by participants. So some people focused on how heat impacted individual thermal comfort, so a person's actual experience of heat in the city. And we actually heard stories of construction workers collapsing due to heat stress, or the homeless being unable to thermoregulate due to a lack of air conditioning. But other participants contextualized the impacts of heat within broader economic, political, and environmental processes, such as the impact of heat on the economy or on the health and emergency systems in the city. And these different ways of understanding the impacts and the causes of the urban heat island effect speak to just how complex and how wicked this problem really is. So let's dig in a little bit and look at the technology and the information flow that was used by our participants. So first, I want to say that none of the participants worked in isolation. All of the work was highly collaborative, and they used standard communication tools such as phones and emails to reach out to their collaborators, who were quite diverse as well. But in addition, everyone relied on a range of digital tools to collect different types of data to inform their work. So almost every participant used some form of online data sets to inform their practice, including weather reports, census and income data, traffic data, remote sensing. A lot of the participants actually also took their own measurements and conducted local monitoring. So for instance, the grassroots activist participants installed temperature sensors at different heights on their street to see the variations in surface temperatures. And the microclimate researcher actually had his own weather station that he took around the city to study microclimates. And the construction workers had temperature monitoring at a lot of the sites. In addition, participants also kept records of their practice. So they took notes, they sometimes took photographs and video, and they reached out to other stakeholders through focus groups, online surveys, and workshops to gather feedback on their work. All of the participants really wanted to share the data they were collecting, but for the most part, this was done through unstructured email, phone calls, or texts. And so because of this, most of the information was disseminated in kind of ad hoc ways. And there was a structural gap for comparing information across the different sources that participants were using. And these comparisons were necessary because the data collected by participants was sometimes different across sources. So, for example, we've heard reports of temperature locally being a lot hotter than what was predicted by the weather. And also in the case of the grassroots initiatives that were trying to cool city streets, they reported their streets were 10 degrees cooler because of some of the vegetation that they planted on the street. So, so clearly with that, that points to this idea that the hybrid data was needed to be compared, but there was no systematic way for participants to do this. So in terms of addressing the problem of heat, participants' work covers both adaptation and mitigation approaches. So participants had some very practical strategies for improving individuals' coping capacity to help people deal with extreme heat. So for example, distributing water and sunscreen, providing shade, offering air-conditioned facilities, reducing activity levels in the case of the construction workers. But all participants also discussed hybrid approaches that supported both mitigation and adaptation. For instance, all participants talked about trees and vegetation as well as green roofs, because these provide cooling for the environment through evapotranspiration, but they also mitigate climate change by absorbing stormwater and increasing local biodiversity. Pervious surfaces, or pale pavement, which is what you see in this picture, is actually a stretch of a pale pavement road installed in a neighborhood in Sydney. So pervious areas are not sealed on the one hand, and they reduce thermal mass, but also for flood mitigation, they get evapotranspiration and even the temperature difference. But even with these hybrid approaches, a lot of participants actually critique the fact that they were overly narrow. So in many cases, there were unintended consequences, such as a road development project taking down trees in a neighborhood, for instance. And also these projects not taking all of the stakeholders into account. So the construction worker union member told us, well, a lot of green buildings and the ratings, as you know, are self-regulated and self-reporting and all that. The process and the workers themselves don't need to be looked at in their eyes, so yeah, they get forgotten. So to overcome these challenges, all of the participants wanted to see a more systemic approach to the urban heat island effect. They proposed systemic solutions that engage all stakeholders in the process, so including vulnerable populations, residents, social scientists, engineers, designers, policymakers in addressing this problem. And with that, they really stressed this idea of promoting social equity. So the way participants saw themselves is, well, we're working in as an ecosystem, and every part of it is really important. But it's all about empowering people to say they are important in this. And also this quote, which I absolutely love. So the main challenge around sustainability is not the technology, because we have that. It's more around social equity. It's around, can we make it a more fair society and a society that's more inclusive and politically tolerant society? So really highlighting these systemic and value-driven approaches to the problem. And finally, participants also wanted to see an overall shift in language and values. So they wanted to kind of associate sustainability with the norm or with high quality rather than this fringe thing that only some of the sustainable people were doing. So ideally, I'd love to see the phrase green design just disappear, that green would just disappear and it just becomes design, and that is the norm. And I should say that this picture, this is actually a light switch of a house that's completely off-grid in Sydney, and the owner was like really proud to show us that, well, this house is off-grid, but you wouldn't even know it. It's the norm. This looks like a normal house, but the system actually is off-grid and uses solar power. So now I'll just like to conclude with two implication areas for addressing wicked problems through HCI. And so our findings show that participants rely on hybrid information sources, but they didn't always have the structures in place for systematically sharing or comparing this data. And so this suggests an opportunity for future HCI knowledge systems to gather different types of information. And this information might include temperature sensing, qualitative reports of local knowledge, thermal imaging, healthcare statistics, or policy findings. And then new interactive tools can support broader dissemination of this data. So HCI systems can make hybrid data more accessible to different stakeholders, including construction workers, or activists, policymakers, builders, engineers, or architects. And in particular, this could be done through place-based installations and physical knowledge systems, which can be very powerful for engaging stakeholders on the ground in their context. And finally, our research uncovered some interesting tensions between the complex systems of actors, values, and initiatives around urban heat. So here we propose documentary filmmaking as a particularly powerful approach for supporting discourse at scale. So on the one hand, there are many HCI opportunities for crowdsourcing, sharing, and co-producing media content, especially as low-cost cameras such as the ones on our phones become more available. So this could potentially democratize content production and share firsthand experiences. And then the collected content could be annotated and shared to enable stakeholders to collectively examine their practices and their challenges and the dependencies around big issues. So this could potentially build empathy and help overcome some of the barriers for collaboration. So to wrap up, our study reveals heat as a complex problem that is interlinked with issues beyond individual thermal comfort. And this problem is entangled with concerns around economy, climate change, social justice, and the public health care concerns. So going forward, I've suggested HCI knowledge systems for sharing hybrid data and also tools for supporting discourse through documentary filmmaking. And I hope our work has contributed to HCI paradigms for holistically addressing the big challenges of our time. Thank you.
This is a great talk, Stacey. Thank you so much. James Clausen from Indiana. My question is really a methods question. I'm really intrigued by this documentary approach and why, and I can totally see how it's a powerful way that's different from just doing interviews. Mm-hmm. Is it really that you felt like your participants got a broader sense of audience because they were doing it in front of a camera and that changed their answers? Or can you speculate a little bit about the differences between the documentary interview approach versus just a normal interview?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. First, I should say that actually we have another write-up coming up of just the methodological contribution of this work, so thank you for bringing that up. So I think there are unique trade-offs with this method, and I think you kind of touched on this idea of accountability. So it is a little different when your interview is not anonymized and you're speaking to the general public, right? So that on one hand kind of empowers certain stakeholders. Like in our case, we felt that the homeless and some of the vulnerable community groups were like maybe more empowered, and the local grassroots activist group as well. But it also kind of gives people like an agenda to push, whereas like an anonymous interview, maybe it's a little bit more, I don't want to say more honest, but maybe slightly different goals there for participating. So, and also this method gives us, the researchers, more accountability, I think, because we have to then present this kind of footage in a non-anonymized version eventually. So I think there's interesting trade-offs there, yeah.
Can I ask another question? So are you showing the documentary? So now you've created a documentary. What are you going to do with that as an artifact, and how does that kind of fit into future research plans? Are you continuing to work in heat, or where else are you going to go?
Yeah, so that's the plan. Thanks for that. So the plan is to show it to the stakeholders and then make it public. And then the methods paper will kind of cover some of the methodological insights on that. And yeah, to answer your other question, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, so like heat, yes, I'm very focused on heat. It's I live in the hottest city in the States, so yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, this is great.
Yeah, hi, me again. Gilbert, Omi University. Did your stakeholders, after making this documentary with you, express any kind of, oh cool, I want to keep doing this, I'm going to keep the approach but make it my own, and maybe like put forth more documentaries? Was that something that came up?
So we haven't shown it yet, it's still being edited, so I don't know. I hope that would be a cool outcome, right? If we actually help. I mean, that is kind of one of the hopes, is this would give voice to some of these diverse actors and also put them publicly in conversation with each other, because I should say the people in the movie have not met each other, like except for the two local activist participants. They don't really know each other, but interestingly, the interviews were very like interlinked, and their work is maybe more related than perhaps they realized. So another thing we hope is that maybe it bridges some of the gaps, the structural gaps that the paper talks about. And
do you think that they kind of perceive this as getting like a kind of media training that they could take away something from participating in your study?
That's a great question. I mean, I think my personal vision of this would be that people could make their own documentaries, and that the tools would be so easy that they don't need us actually at all to put forward this kind of content. But in this case, that was not the case. Like, they participated in the interviews, but not the filming or the editing.
okay.
But that is an interesting point, is like bringing people to the editing process as well. So yeah, that's something
Thank
to
you.
think about. Thanks.
Thanks, Stacey. Adrian Friday, Lancaster University. I think it's lovely work, and it pushes my buttons in terms of thermal comfort and interesting, rich methods. I mean, I think it feels to me like in terms of sustainability, all the predictions towards increased urbanisation, not decrease. I'm interested in how do you start to get the evidence together to kind of challenge that at scale, and this seems one of the, like all video ethnographic techniques, this is really a lot of labour. So I wonder if you have any insights on how we start scaling up the method and we can start to challenge some of that dogma, really.
Scaling the documentary method itself. Yeah, so like kind of what we talk about on the paper is democratizing the content production through personal cameras and actually having some form of media reporting from people on the ground using their own devices, kind of how citizen science kind of reports sensor data, maybe having people report their media content, and then have some automated ways of maybe classifying or annotating it and then sharing it more broadly. But yes, I completely agree with the overall goal of making it more scalable. Yeah.
So do you think we're going to get some tools where we can kind of start to gather this on an urban scale?
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea, actually, like a toolkit for people to make their own documentaries. I think would be very exciting.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Let's thank Stacey again. And if you enjoyed this session, there are a couple of more sustainability related sessions in the conference. So there's a SIG